the elite becomes narrower and narrower and more spoiled and less capable and more separated from the people they are
And
supposed to lead.
You're describing Rome. That's what
I'm describing every sophisticated civilization, and we are no exception. The United States has a leadership crisis. You want to know what it looks like? Go on YouTube and see a video clip of Mr. Biden over the last 4 years.
This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I am Gaius. Germanicus is here. We're by the Thames. It's wintry. We're as warm as we can be in our wine cellar, drinking a cup of wine. All the centurions retired and their families have gone on home. We're lingering because of the possibilities in the 21st century that need our attention. It doesn't suddenly come to Germanicus and myself, but gradually it weighs upon us, not to mention that the developing conversation between the emperor-to-be, Mr. Trump, and his counselor, lieutenant, master of the horse, Elon Musk, is ripe for Shakespearean turns of phrases. We're going to apply the first century and the BCE, however, to remind everyone that a Caesar always has a master of the horse, and it doesn't go well. As they gain power, they fall apart from each other. And then, Germanicus, a very good evening to you. Mr. Musk and Mr. Trump, they enter into the fray as a dynamic duo. There is a third party, however. That would be Mr. Vance, the vice president, the adopted son, the heir apparent. Mr. Trump, as emperor, has one term left. So I'm going to remind both of us that he's only as strong now as he will be at the end of his term-limited years, when he is 82 years old and he cannot influence next January. It's taken from him by law. He can challenge it, but he can't count on it. Musk, however, is inhibited only by a little frill in the Constitution that is fussy about where you're born. The Vance succession would be the straightforward Senator, Marine, best-selling writer, rises from humble beginnings to become the emperor and the heir apparent. And therein lies the challenge. Which is the model we're going to choose? Will it be Vance rises and Musk steps aside? Will it be Trump leaves the scene and Vance and Musk fight it out? Will it be Musk storms out of the palace and waits his time to strike in future? Will it be Vance finds a way to undercut Musk? Or will it be Mr. Trump who fires them both? Good evening to you, Germanicus.
Good evening, Gaius. We have such a, I won't say rich, but such an enormous palette of historical colors to choose from. And the thought with rivals is important because in any imperial court there are rivals, and the question is how adroit, canny, and insightful is the emperor in being able to get the most out of his rivals and at the same time to keep them from going head to head in some kind of terrifying, confrontation. And a weak emperor would be out of his depth, and you would have what amounted to much of Roman history, which is a implicit civil war between rivals. I mean, we could look at the Third Reich, of course, and Herr Hitler was brilliant at divide and conquer with all of his major people because they never knew where they stood with him, and they were constantly at war with one another, and yet he managed to keep them all occupied against each other. And while he just sort of magisterially orchestrated things the way he wanted. It was a useful way to avoid the kind of paranoia that, say, Stalin succumbed to at the same time. But I would go actually to other more normative contexts. I think one of them, of course, is Augustus. Augustus Caesar had Marcus Agrippa as his right-hand man, the man who had, cinched the imperial grass crown for him at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. And and yet Agrippa, for all of his capabilities, never sought to overturn Augustus. He also had no uh, rival, but he was never made officially the heir, as far as I know, because of the way things progressed. I mean, Augustus always had heirs, some of whom, for a time before they died, were the sons of Agrippa. But I think a better example from more recent times would be the period of the formation of Wilhelmine Germany under Wilhelm I with Bismarck and Moltke, because Bismarck and Moltke were rivals, and yet uh, they had their own spheres within which they operated. And the fact that they operated in very different spheres meant that their competition could be relatively easily adjudicated. In other words, Moltke was the military man. He basically um, made the great German victory in the Franco-Prussian War happen. He had enormous power and influence, but in that realm. Whereas Bismarck, who had created the German state, was nonetheless not the master of it. He was, like Moltke, a servant of the king. And the king of Prussia became the emperor of the new Germany, and Bismarck was not the heir. Neither was Moltke. Now, the way in which this all comes together is to look at Mr. Musk and Mr. Vance in terms of the actual compass of the orbits of power that they inhabit and the trajectory of those orbits. So, Mr. Musk, like Moltke, is the master of technology, of all of the arts, of the externalization of American power, and also the future, the true trajectory into space of American possibility, and hence of the larger yearning for American destiny to be fulfilled at some point. But Mr. Vance, who's actually the adopted son, just as it was in late Rome, and the heir apparent, has a very different compass, and that is he is the man connected to the people who brought Mr. Trump into office. And he has the capacity and the charter to be their voice. And so you have perhaps an uneasy relationship, but I don't yet see the signs of a head-to-head. And to take this a little bit further, if we look at Mr. Musk, he is like a great duke in the medieval period, and yet he is not a truly political figure. He
What if
doesn't.
Mark Antony, master of the horse?
Yes.
What
Oh,
if,
oh.
and when Caesar steps aside, in Caesar's case, he was assassinated by the cabal, who
Mhm.
rise up thinking the Romans will celebrate us. They did not. Antony grabbed the treasury. I think Mr. Musk already has the treasury in his pocket. In any event, Antony then waged a war against the assassins, and that
Right.
turned into the Civil War. I'm looking at turmoil here that can go on for several years, not just ending in the next election cycle.
Well, you can see the point I'm making. I mean, right now, Musk has a following, but the following is superficial. It is a following based on the entire uh, complete um, narrative of the triumph and return of Mr. Trump, and he is a key figure in that. But I don't see him having, first of all, the political um, dedicated constituencies which are required to vie for power in this imperial arena, and B, he's not in and of himself a political actor. Mark Antony had incredibly he had an emotional following, especially among his soldiers, obviously, because that's where the Roman civil wars had brought Roman society at the, end of the millennium. And he was an adroit, deeply invested political figure. He was a politician through and through, as much as he was a soldier through and through. And Mr. Musk is still, in that sense, operating at the periphery. He has a tremendous emotional following for his achievements. It would be almost as though Thomas Edison were in a position where he was the right-hand man of McKinley in 1896, and he put McKinley over the top. That wasn't.
Let's go to 2027 then, right
Yeah.
there. Trump is going to step aside from history.
Yes.
It's mandated.
It's part of the story.
The road ahead, is it Musk or is it Vance? Who will choose?
Now, here is where it gets interesting, because the next several years will be a testing time. And the testing will start very soon, because there are plenty of rather obdurate, either neocons or aggressive, uh, let's go get 'em types that are going to be in Mr. Trump's cabinet. And Vance and Tulsi Gabbard are two of those who stand against that tide. So, what will be essential to watch is whether or not J.D. Vance is able to expand the implicit, and I hope inherent, aspect of restraint in the Trumpian vision.
I'm talking
and,
about policy.
and
I'm
make
talking about status. He's president of the Senate. He represents the optimates.
Well, it's about whether he's able to make that vision work. If he is able to extend and own the Trump vision in terms of where it's going, then he will be the man in charge. If he fails at that, and if there are foreign policy disasters or wars, he could find himself potentially a forlorn and tragic figure. So it is something that we cannot foresee, and yet we can foresee what is required of him. And I think he will do everything he can to achieve that. Now, Mr. Musk, on the other hand, is in, I think, a shakier position. He can achieve enormously powerful things in terms of realizing the Trump vision, but he is ultimately expendable. And in order for him to be a contender, he would have to translate what he achieves, and I think he will achieve many great things, since he already has, and that's his MO. He will have to achieve things that work to move him into the political arena as a political actor, not as the magnificent ducal outsider that he has been and still represents.
Right now, Labor is entertaining in a headline in London, passing a law to prohibit Musk from giving $100 million to Farage
Right.
for the new party right now. So Musk has already left sovereign America. He's moved into sovereign Europe. That he's moving very fast, and that will bring him in contention with a number of governances, not the least of which is ours. You're right, he's not a political actor. He's impatient with politics.
He's a supra-political actor, and he has incredible capacity to have a decisive impact. You can contrast Mr. Musk, say, to George Soros, who is your standard traditional, let's give money, let's make squeeze happen, let's operate at the edges, let's try and insinuate ourselves like a bunch of moles into the rotting fabric of capitalism, as Stalin said. But Musk has gone way beyond that.
Uh,
He's become a transcendent figure.
He's also he has an advantage against every other politician because he's not term limited.
No, look, as he achieves great things, which he will, I hope, continue to do because they are all hopeful things that he has achieved, he will have increasing um, influence and authority. But I don't see how that translates into the political sphere because he's not.
Is he Augustus?
I think he becomes a kind of super figure who influences things above and beyond the level of politics. That's why I brought up Edison, and you could also bring up, the Wright brothers, Alexander Graham Bell. These were men who had outsized impact on the world, and the fact that he is using that more directly in terms of an agenda for humankind and for the US, but for all humanity too, makes him a figure that goes beyond that of political office. For example, I couldn't see him running. I couldn't see him going through the political process. He's not the kind of guy who is going to operate in that realm. However, he could. Let's kind of distort the metaphor a little and push it to its farthest limits. He could become a kind of Bismarck in the sense that he is having a wider agenda that will be fulfilled within the political sphere by others. So, frankly, and I know this isn't going in the direction of a civil war between rivals, but he could become the kind of a Deus ex machina figure for someone like J.D. Vance that would create a very powerful team. Now, that's being positive. We don't know how that will work, but essentially, that is exactly how Trump has embraced Mr. Musk as someone who will operate over and above, but with the positive effects of his actions redounding to the political strength and authority of Mr. Trump. So, I mean, that's a path that I would see in the hopeful vein.
It's Christmas spirit you've taken home. And I've never anticipated you being this rosy about my idea of daggers behind their backs. Okay, let us turn to warlordism. I'm speaking with Germanicus. We're in Londinium. It's 91. It's coming 91 AD. Domitian is in Rome. We're very far from Rome. We know that here in Roman Britain, we have maybe 320 years left, 340 years left, and we will abandon ship the Roman Britons. We'll be pushed out, slaughtered. In fact, there's an image at the end of Roman Britain of the houses, the jewelry, the people all being mashed up like a wine press, blood flowing in the cities. That's what the end is for us here in Roman Britain. But we're looking to the 21st century to reproduce what we've learned in the first century AD. We're going to now turn to warlords. We know warlords. They're coming. Vladimir Putin is a warlord. He's a successful warlord. He is conquering the European understanding of its security. It's gone. Europe no longer feels secure. It looks to the United States for leadership, perhaps. It looks to Russia for making deals, perhaps. Will there be a younger warlord in the near future? Here's why. Europe is extremely persuaded by warlords. The history of Europe and warlords extends from the end of the Roman Empire all the way till today. Germanicus and I have been talking about Attila riding out of the Hungarian plain. He had no successor that held up, but while he was good, he was very, very good. In our own time, a warlord like that would be Bonaparte. Bonaparte was a no one, outside. He was barely French. He was mostly Corsican Italian, a low aristocratic family. And yet, he conquered Europe and was ready to conquer America. And then, fate turned against him. Germanicus, is Europe aware that they're tempted by warlords, that they're persuaded by Putin, that they will take a knee to Putin and they'll wait for their own warlord? Does Europe know this about itself?
The idea of the warlord, ipso facto, necessarily emerges from a context where the old authority has come apart. The reason the warlord exists is to provide some kind of order in a world that has lost it and has lost hope in it. And so the dream of every warlord, and it's realized by just a tiny fraction of them, is to be the founder of a new legitimacy, a new framework of authority and stability. That was, of course, the hope of Attila. It was the fervent dream of Napoleon. And of course, it is intrinsic to everything that Mr. Putin does today because he seeks to create a new framework because the last two failed, of course. The the Romanovs are gone. Their world, their framework is no longer possible. The communist world failed. Lenin, Stalin, that's all gone. It failed fabulously. However, there are elements of both that potentially can be woven into a new Russian vision, and every ounce of his energy is directed toward achieving that, and he has been remarkably successful. And and so he may yet transcend the not epithet, but the unhappy title, because it has pejorative implications always, of warlord. Now, Europe seeks someone like that, and it is hard pressed to find someone like that, in large part because Europe is still run by people who come out of the establishment, and you can't make it in the establishment unless you physically take a knife to your body and cut out every organ that wants to lead, that wants to have a vision, that wants to speak of things as they are, that wants to truly connect with the people. You've got to excise those and hopefully survive the surgery. And so it's very hard to find. I mean, you can look at those who seem to have some elements of that leadership. You know, there's Giorgia Meloni, there's of course Mr. Orban in Hungary, but you don't. It's very hard, and I think there will have to be a revolutionary comings apart in Europe that will lead to the emergence of someone who can, at first, appear as a warlord, and then, if he or she is particularly adroit and compelling, create a new framework, a successor framework. Europe is in desperate need of a successor framework. The EU is the most mind numbing, soul crushing vision I have ever encountered for a polity. And the face of the EU as Ms. van der Leyden is best representative, is one that simply cannot continue much longer. But how that happens is going to be difficult. You have a very old population and people who are very dependent on the state for generations of social welfare. Things have to be ripped apart. We'll see what happens in France with Madame Le Pen. There's possibility there, but an authentic figure like Napoleon Bonaparte, that's going to be hard. And it can happen, but it can often happen in ways that are not happy. Benito Mussolini is a good example, but of course, Mussolini, like Herr Hitler, followed a terrible ordeal, namely World War I and its aftermath. And Europe is not in that position yet. It's in a position of increasing privation, of impending recession, severe recession. But how someone emerges in that context requires, I think, some kind of revolutionary, um, dispensation.
Defeatism always prefers a hero to
Yes.
and they are defeatist right now. They've got the condition for it. You're looking for events. Although I find you being rosy again, Germanicus. Let's try one more time.
Okay, I'll try.
Germanicus and I are in Londinium by the Thames, and it's chilly, and we're reflecting on the events of the 21st century. And I want to assert, Germanicus, that I've been reading, always dangerous. I've been reading 5th century AD. That's Attila, but it's the Goths, it's the Huns, it's the Vandals, it's the Visigoths. It's the West, Rome, withering. It's the East, Constantinople, gaining strength and worried about the Persians. It's tribes reverting to their origins because the Goths are gone, or the Huns are gone, or the Vandals are gone. It's Constantinople raising up a fleet to conquer the Vandals and losing, and running out of money, and pulling back and abandoning Rome. That's the 5th century AD. So I think to myself, well, that's a familiar model. What would that look like in the 22nd century? And I contend, Germanicus, and this is a test of your rosy scenario at Christmas time, it will be all against all. We've been living in the 20th and 21st century in the exception, not the rule. We've been living in the 20th and 21st century. What we thought was constant war was in fact prosperity and security compared to what has been and what will be, all against all. The tribes go their own way. They contend locally, regionally, transnationally. And America at first retreats and then is attacked and then fragments and then revives and then pulls back. In other words, following the Roman model. So they'll remember us in 1,000 years, but it will be in this fashion. The question will be, why did the American empire fail? They'll ask that 1,000 years from now. And what will the answer be, Germanicus?
Well, Gaius, you confronted me with a challenge to be pessimistic. And so I will do my best to come through because the fact is that things don't look very good looking ahead. And the big problems of the world are today and in the coming generations aren't necessarily that different from the issues that beset late Rome. As you pointed out, there was a huge disparity between the Eastern and Western Roman empires. The Eastern Empire in the 5th century was 20 times wealthier than the West. And I talked to a fantastic historian who, Michael McCormick, whom I know well, has a huge book on the economy of Europe after the 5th century. And he told me things collapsed quickly in the 5th century because they were all inflated. They were all held up by the presence of the state. So all these, for example, cities in Germany that we remember, like Trier, were held up by state expenditure and by the army. So the army's presence kept the Roman Empire going. You know, this is true of Roman Britain, for example. And when the army left, everything fell apart, and it fell apart very quickly. Now, if you look at the US today, what's going on? Well, the US has deindustrialized to a great extent. It has lost its work ethos, and it's lost the access to reliable people who can work and who have skills.
We
Plus,
can't have 355 ships in the Navy unless we use the Korean shipyards and the
if
Chinese
you think
shipyards.
of that, the Navy's going down to 150 ships. We can't build, we can't maintain, we can't man these ships. We're screwed. Now, to add to this, we have a collapsing fertility, which is being masked by artificial immigration. But when you bring in migrants who aren't culturally part of the American ethos, you create the potential for disruption, potentially of decline. And so actually the migrants into the Roman Empire were a much smaller percentage of the Roman population than the migrants coming into the US today. The
Why,
US
why did America fail? A thousand years from now, what will they say about us?
The failure of elite leadership. It's a complete collapse of the elite as the elite became self-indulgent, self-focused, and greedy and selfish. Everything that Piketty wrote about in his book on capitalism, looking at what happened in France in the 19th century from all their records, shows that the elite keep their money and they become richer over time, and the elite becomes narrower and narrower and more spoiled and less capable and more separated from the people they are
And you're
supposed to lead.
describing you're describing Rome. That's
I'm
what you're.
describing I'm describing every sophisticated civilization, and we are no exception. The United States has a leadership crisis. You want to know what it looks like? Oh, go on YouTube and see a video clip of Mr. Biden over the last 4 years, or how Ms. Harris got to be the Democratic nominee, or look at Nancy Pelosi, defenestrating AOC in a final spasm of selfishness as a gerontocrat in her 80s. This is a collapsing world at the top. American people, including all the migrants, including all the poor people who have stopped looking for work, who might be on, fentanyl or OxyContin or whatever the hell, they have been deserted by the elite. The elite has failed the people, and America is unraveling. The Trump victory is a recognition by real people that this needs to be turned around. But it is unlikely that a single administration, with all of its limitations, and the fact that you have wonderful people who might do great things like Elon Musk, it is not enough. History says it is not enough. There were great Roman emperors in the 5th century. And as you said, one of them, Majorian, a terrific guy who was set to revive the Western Empire, he came to naught because he tried to attack the Vandals. And Geseric burned down his fleet in 464, and he was done. And so that was the last really effective Roman emperor. Look at the great Magister Militum, Aetius, the man who defeated the Huns. He defeated.
All right, let's stay with Europe.
He was murdered.
In
No,
19,
this is the problem for the U.S. So you want to know about the 22nd century? Well, it doesn't look great.
in 1917, England lied to us and we entered into a war that was none of our business.
Right.
We lost our we lost our bright smile. And then the flu hit us and we lost more of it.
Right.
1940, we were lied to again. That war was completely useless. It was It was Berlin versus London in some kind of sword fight, replaying the trenches of the First War. And those who wanted to enter into the war never entertained the fact that the war was about nothing, that Hitler was not going to go anywhere if France had mobilized. We know this. France knew it at the time, but refused.
Well, then what about Ukraine? It's the same thing, and it's taking us to the same place.
All right, so we recognize that. We do. Europe will always come up with these false choices for America. And I contribute my observation, and I'm not certain about this, but I contribute this, that we've been misled by Europe for 100 years, and we're still vulnerable to it.
We are. And the only hopeful glimmer is that we now have, on the cusp of his second presidency, a man who understands that.
Yes, I'm going to allow that to stand as a testimony to Germanicus being extremely generous here on Christmas Eve. It's another day will do gloom, but today Germanicus has successfully found a happy ending to every scenario I've thrown up. I'm going to acknowledge the genius of it. Germanicus is Michael Vlahos. I am Gaius, John Batchelor. We're in Londinium. We're going on to the theater. Last week it was Jugglers. It was very funny. But tonight, they put it up on the board to be determined. So we're going to show up. They're probably choir singing tonight. The Christians will out. But in any event, we sacrifice to the great god Augustus on the way. And we'll return without the rosy scenario in the new year. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I'm John Batchelor.